Hello friends of the channel, I'm Dr. Nelson Marquez, and today we're going to talk about signs of dementia that we can't ignore long before the problem is present, about 10 years before you have dementia. And one of those signs might be that you notice a decrease in coordination in your ability to control your movements. You might not be able to pick up an object as well as you used to, something that's being thrown at you, perhaps, or picking up something that you've dropped. You might not be using tools or utensils as well as you used to. You don't have the same precision and precise control that you used to have. You might notice a little more clumsiness. You trip over things, stub your toe, bump into things as you move. Or it might be fine motor skills, like buttoning a shirt, tying your shoelaces, or tying a tie, and it's not as easy as it used to be. These might be some slight tremors, just a little tremor in your hands that wasn't there before. All of these would indicate a decrease in motor control. And don't jump to conclusions. This doesn't mean you're headed for dementia. But it's something to watch out for, because it means your brain cells aren't as healthy. They're not firing as accurately. They're not developing as much energy as they used to. And if your brain is slowly degenerating, that increases the likelihood of dementia. The biggest thing we need to understand about dementia and about any other disease process is that we have the default model wrong. People often think of disease as something that happens all of a sudden, that we're living our lives in a healthy way as long as we don't have any symptoms. We're just going along being healthy. And then one day, all of a sudden, maybe in our 50s, we go to the doctor because we're not feeling well, and now they give us a diagnosis. And most people hear that diagnosis, and they perceive it as something that just happened all of a sudden, as if you were healthy, and suddenly you get sick. And the default way to deal with that, of course, is to treat the symptoms with medication. In fact, we're not making anything work better. And the years go by, and then, at about age 80 or so, we suddenly drop dead, as if it happens in solid increments like that, as if it's black or white. But the reality is more like the functional view. We have a certain amount of function. Let's say we start out with 100% function, and nature is very generous to us at the beginning because we get about 20 years for free. Your body develops. There's no degeneration because your body is conditioned. It's programmed to develop and build and get stronger. So by age 20 or so, you're at peak function. But then that function starts to decline. Every year, you lose a small percentage of function, but you're still above that threshold where you feel healthy. You don't have any symptoms. And then one day, you get into the zone where you have some symptoms, but of course it didn't happen all of a sudden. It just felt like it. And if you're in the standard model, if you just treat your symptoms with medication, now you're not adding any function. You're not doing anything about the root causes. You're not providing anything more than what the body needs to function. So your function continues to decline until the point where you have 0% function left. So if you understand this functional model, that we have a certain amount of energy that starts to decline after our 20s, then when do you want to start doing something about it? Well, every single part of the body is absolutely essential. There are no spare body parts. There are no optional body parts. But I would say the brain is the most important part of the body because it controls everything else. Everything else depends on the brain for its subsistence, so to speak, for its functioning, for its quality. But most of all, more than anything, the brain is very important to your quality of life. There is a direct relationship between the health of your brain and the quality of your life. Your brain is also one of the most difficult organs to regenerate. That doesn't mean it's impossible. That doesn't mean that it always moves in a downhill direction, but it's harder than other organs. And one of the reasons it's harder than other organs is that there's a kind of point of no return. It's when your cognition, when your brain function, has fallen below a certain point. Now you have no motivation to change that. So the brain relies on the brain to change that. Your heart can change anyway if you feed someone better. You could improve certain things in the body. But the brain needs the brain and the motivation to develop and maintain that quality of life and to regenerate itself. And that's why it's critical that no matter what age we are, wherever we are on this continuum of function, that we start right now, that we understand that the brain is the most important organ. And the earlier we understand how it works and what it needs, the better we'll be able to maintain and sustain that function for as long as possible. And then I would mention another thing that I encounter a lot as a practitioner, which is, what about children? And now you're saying, well, it's okay. My kids don't have dementia. Of course they don't. But what I'm saying is, people think that once you have diabetes, now you have to eat right, you have to change that. And I get so many people who say that the hardest part is that there's junk food in the house. I can eat well for a week, but then my kids' food, my kids' bread, my kids' junk food is in the house, and it's so hard to resist. And I just want to ask, what is junk food doing to kids in the house? Why would you want your kids to eat junk and end up in the place where you are, where they have a diagnosis? Why not teach them as early as possible how to eat and how the body works, so that they don't have the same problems that you developed? The next sign has to do with gait, posture, and movement. So it could be something as simple as a shuffling gait, that you're dragging your feet a little bit, or your steps are a little bit shorter. Your steps aren't as long as they used to be. Maybe you're losing a little bit of that spring in your step. Or it could be a hunched posture. So how many people do you see, as they get a little bit older, that have this happen? And it can be very subtle, but it means something. So one of the most common signs is forward carriage of the head, but it can also be internal rotation. So if you notice people's arms, they should hang parallel to their body. But if they turn a little bit, that's a sign that the brain doesn't have quite the same firepower to turn off the muscles that turn the hands. That internal rotation is a sign of stress, but it's also a sign of brain degeneration. And it could also be forward carriage of the head, internal rotation of the shoulders, pulling the shoulders up, turning the hands inward. These are all signs of the same mechanism. And I'm sure if you've been paying attention, or if you're going to pay attention, you'll see something called hip and knee flexion as part of that pattern with internal rotation. So, guys, the head goes forward, the hands turn inward, and now also the hips go back a little bit, and the knees bend a little bit. And the stronger the brain is, the stronger it will be able to hold that posture. And as the brain starts to get weaker, we're going to have all of these signs to some extent. But here's what we want to understand about the brain and about neurology. That everything that you can observe, every diagnostic sign, is also a form of therapy. That means that if you observe that and then do the opposite, if you have a forward head position and work on your posture, if you have your shoulders rolled and move them back, and if you practice that, if you pay attention, if you put more spring in your step, if you straighten your knees, if you stand with your hips, now you're actually building the pathways that are supposed to maintain that function. I'm sure you've heard of use it or lose it. So the more you pay attention and practice that, the more you're actually building your brain to maintain that function. Another thing you might notice is that when it comes to your gait and movement, everything feels a little stiffer. Your movements aren't as smooth and fluid as they used to be. Then you might notice some changes in your balance or spatial awareness, the ability to observe and be aware of your surroundings without actually paying direct attention to them. And if that starts to diminish, you might notice that you're a little unsteady on your feet or walking. It might feel like you're stumbling or you're straight up stumbling, or you just think you're stumbling and need to grab onto something. You might be misjudging the distance and timing of things, like the distance to stationary or moving objects. And if they're moving, you might misjudge the timing of when something is going to happen. Also, you might find it a little harder to multitask when it comes to moving. And this might be like doing something while you're walking or walking and turning at the same time, and you find that you have to do one thing at a time. So it's like you have to stop first and then turn, or you'll feel a little bit unstable with it. And when it comes to muscle and body movement, you might notice something as simple as muscle stiffness, that your body doesn't stretch and relax like it used to. This would especially apply to spinal stiffness, and that's why yoga is so important and so beneficial. Because yoga is all about keeping your spine flexible. And why is that important? Because 90% of the input of the signals that keep your brain alive come from your body, from body movement and gravity. And the vast majority of those signals come from your spine. You have so many more receptors. You have more receptors in your spine for movement and spatial awareness, called proprioception, than you have in the rest of your body combined. So as your brain starts to decline, because it's not getting those signals, that results in spinal stiffness. But if you maintain that spinal flexibility, You're now allowing those signals to flow and keep your brain alive. Another thing that can happen is restless legs. And don't jump to conclusions and say, "Oh my God, I've got restless legs. I'm getting dementia." No, that's one way you can get restless legs, is if your brain starts to get a little bit weaker and it's not able to inhibit some of these spontaneous actions and signals from your legs. But there are a lot of other causes as well. If you've watched my other videos, like inflammation, pH, mineral status, etc. And then we're getting into the things that most people think of as mild cognitive decline. The first thing that happens is you start to forget names. You start to forget words and tasks, or even recent events. And again, this is something that happens to everyone, so don't jump to conclusions. It's about how much it happens, and when it actually becomes a problem. This mild cognitive decline can also result in difficulty concentrating and organizing. Once your brain is able to stay focused on a task and keep track of the different things that it has to deal with and organize to get something done, it becomes much harder. As a result, you may find that you have difficulty completing tasks, especially if they are more complex tasks that require focused and sustained attention. And you may also notice that your mind is wandering, and it can be difficult to stay focused on a task like that. But it could also be that your mind is wandering and you get lost in conversations. It could also affect your communication, so some people will have subtle changes in their speech. It might be that they speak more slowly than before, or it could be an occasional slurred speech where they can't pronounce or form certain words correctly. It can be difficult to find the words, and of course, again, this happens to everyone. It's just a question of how much it happens. Is it getting worse? And at what point does it become a problem? You may notice a reduction in facial expression. There is less movement in the facial muscles, and this can lead to less animated speech, but also less effect. An effect in speech is how much emotion you involve, how much intonation, how much variation. What is the melody of the speech that you are producing? And if you don't have much effect, then it sounds monotonous. It sounds very monotonous, like you're just droning on. The slowing down of the brain can also start to affect your handwriting. And this is something that people used to do with pen and paper before we wrote on keyboards and cell phones. One way that our handwriting can be affected is something called micrographia. This means that the harder it is to control, the harder it is to write, the writing becomes smaller and smaller. It can also become much harder to control. It becomes very, very sloppy and doesn't look as neat as it used to. Another thing that can happen is that we notice that we're more irritable. We lose control, we might have outbursts, or just be more irritable in general. This is because one of the main functions of the brain is to shut things down. So when an irritation arises, when an outburst is about to happen, a well-functioning brain can dampen that down and put it in perspective. But when the brain gets a little bit weaker and slower, it can't control that outburst or that emotion. It could also be social withdrawal, where you don't engage in your community as much because it takes up too much energy, or you don't find it rewarding anymore. You may also experience a lot more anxiety and depression. Again, one of the brain's main functions is to turn off anxious thoughts and depressive thoughts. So the better your brain is functioning, the easier it is to lift your mood. You may also notice a lack of empathy, which means you have a hard time understanding other people's emotions, what they mean, and why they have them. So it's harder for you to understand other people and why they do certain things, or you just don't care about them as much. You may also experience more fatigue, and this would be fatigue even after you've gotten enough sleep. Or you may experience fatigue after minimal exertion, which really shouldn't make you tired. Another sign could be that you start having sleep disorders, because adequate, solid, quality sleep is essential for a well-functioning brain. You may also need to take more frequent naps. But I really want to emphasize how important movement is. I'm sure you've noticed that half or more of all the signals that we're talking about are related to movement. And that 90%, I've said this many times, 90% of the information in the brain is related to movement. And what is the purpose of the brain? The purpose of the brain is to process information. So this 90% of the information that it processes from movement This is the juice that keeps the brain alive, and there is such a tight connection between brain function and movement. So that's why we can pick up these subtle signals first in the signals that have to do with movement. And now we want to understand that movement is extremely important when it comes to using it or losing it. But there are many other aspects of dementia like genetics and inflammation, and so on, just because we get all these subtle signals that I talked about doesn't guarantee that there isn't a 100% association with movement and dementia. But we need to understand that all of these signals have to do with brain degeneration. And if that's happening, if we're losing brain function, that increases the likelihood of developing dementia. These are the first signs because they indicate that there is a lower quality, that your neural networks are degenerating, that there is less energy production, your cells are not able to produce the same amount of energy that they are not able to produce. The same firing rate to control all aspects of movement and function, and your brain is simply not able to do as much as it used to, as fast as it used to, and the way to take control and do something today and every day for the rest of your life to slow and reverse this degeneration is very simple. It's three things. You have to eat better, you have to move better, and you have to think and feel better. So eat better. I talk a lot about, I have hundreds of videos that talk about how to eat to avoid low grade inflammation, metabolic syndrome, to avoid toxicity, etc. A lot about moving better. And that simply means your body is made for movement. You need to take so many thousands of steps. You need to do some stretching. And that doesn't mean you have to go to the gym every day, but your body is made for movement. And so you have to practice thinking better, because if you think better, you will feel better. When you feel better, your body heals itself. When you feel bad, when you feel stressed, when you feel overwhelmed, your brain starts to degenerate, and your brain starts to develop more inflammation. So one of the best things you can do to get healthy is to just be happy. Practice thinking better, read positive things, do relaxation exercises, breathing exercises, do meditation. And I'm sorry to tell you, but if you want to be healthy, you have to pay the price of happiness. There can also be some sensory changes, and one of the most common is a decrease in smell known as anosmia. And it may be that you don't recognize certain things anymore, or it may be that coffee doesn't smell as interesting, or food doesn't smell as interesting as it used to. And another subtle sign of sensory loss can be a difficulty in interpreting sounds, and this would be especially in a noisy environment. But it's not because your sensory apparatus is not there. It's because even with normal hearing, although you can perceive sounds, interpreting and creating an image, and a three-dimensional image of the sound is a very complex process that is taking place in the brain. So again, even though you are hearing but your brain is not working, this can affect your ability to interpret sound. And we can also have changes in vision. You may, for example, have a decreased ability to judge the distance at which your eyes perceive light and transform that into neural impulses. But it is your brain that creates the image, and this can also affect your ability to move in low light. And it may also be that you do not recognize objects as clearly, or it takes you longer to figure out exactly what they are, and some of the subtle signal can also affect executive function. So again, we talked about outbursts. If your brain can't control its impulses now, you may have more spontaneous outbursts than before. It could mean that you're making bad choices. It could be to do with security. You may make unsafe choices, or you may make bad financial decisions. You may be overspending because you don't have the proper boundaries in place. You may find it harder to make decisions, whereas before it was very easy and clear, and now suddenly it's like you can't decide. You hesitate and you just let it sit there. You may see a decrease in spontaneity because you just don't have the motivation to go after things, to do things. Nothing is really fun anymore, and you may find it harder to manage your finances. Then they all suddenly seem more overwhelming. It seems more complex. And it's really hard to keep track of your bills and pay them on time and keep track of budgets. But the biggest thing I want to get across is that your brain controls everything about you, and absolutely everything happens for a reason. If your arm swings differently from side to side, it's not an accident. It's not random. It means something. And I'm not saying that everything has its super important, but we have to start understanding that every little thing is a result of how well the brain is functioning. So if we start paying attention and improving things a little bit at a time, we will also be improving the overall function of the brain. If you like this video, you will see others on our channel, and if you really want to know if your health is in balance by understanding how the body really works, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and turn on all notifications, as well as leave that special like. Until next time, and remember to stay healthy.